Доброго вечора всім. Будемо починати помаленьку. Раді вітати.
Good evening, everybody. We are happy to greet you tonight.
Right now I will switch to English. So good evening, everyone. We are pleased to welcome you to the Center of Urban History for today's event, a lecture by Katarzyna Person. The event follows a two-day workshop that we had here at the center on revisiting the histories of ghetto in occupied territories of contemporary Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania and Moldova. The workshop offered an opportunity to discuss and reflect on the methods, themes and case studies that shape our research and understanding of histories of ghetto in these regions and beyond. This lecture also takes place within our ongoing program Source as a Choice, launched in 2022. The program invites researchers to share their works on war and mass violence in the 19th and 20th centuries. In times of radical violence and cases of total war, the process of creating and preserving sources also became a tool of resisting to violence. Sources, both official documents and especially witnesses' testimonies, were also crucial in the process of seeking the justice, and today we will talk about this more. And the lecture will be held in English, so Ukrainian translation is also provided. Please feel free to take headphones if needed. After Dr. Person's presentation, we will have time for questions and comments, so I warmly invite you to join the discussion. Dr. Katarzyna Person is a historian of the Holocaust and the director of the Warsaw Ghetto Museum. Her work focuses on voices that have been silenced or seen as unfit for the transmission of Holocaust memories, such as women, children, those deemed collaborators, quote-unquote, deportees and refugees. Her publications include Warsaw Ghetto Police Jewish Order Service during the Nazi occupation that was published in 2021. Also Przemysłowo concentration camp, the Children, the Trial, that was published in 2023. And the book that we'll discuss today, The Hour of Revenge, Holocaust Survivors and Their Search for Revenge and Retribution, that was published in 2022 by University of Toronto Press. And talking again about sources, Katarzyna spearheaded the process of publication 27th volume scholarly edition of the Ringenblum Archive in English. This archive, also known as Onek Shabbat Archive, was an initiative and is one of the most significant collections of documents about the Holocaust that was created secretly in the Warsaw Ghetto. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Katarzyna Person. And Katarzyna, that's my great pleasure to pass the mic for you.
Thank you. I'm incredibly happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me, thank you for having me, thank you for coming. So that really means a lot. I'm sorry for lack of presentation, but there is a reason for it. The reason is that when I was looking for pictures and looking through pictures of trials, of revenge, of post-war trials, of collaborators, I felt incredibly uneasy about putting them on. Mainly because of how questionable the sources were, also how questionable and difficult those trials were, in a sense of who is a collaborator, who's guilty, who's not guilty. So I chose not to include them, thus you will have to listen to me for half an hour. I'm also incredibly sorry about how fast I speak. I will try to do my absolute best to speak very slowly, which I probably will not succeed. Okay. So, Search for Justice and Revenge and Retribution. And please don't ask me about definitions of these. That's another thing. If you have a question, how do you define revenge? It's like, not one thing. Okay, so in 1944, a teenage Jewish boy who was hiding in Minsk Mazowiecki near Warsaw wrote in his diary as following: I promised myself that if I will ever be able to carry out revenge, I will have no mercy. And as in the past I couldn't stand the sight of blood, I will murder in cold blood, butcher without pardon. Years later, another Holocaust survivor, who was in Auschwitz-Birkenau as a teenage girl from a Hasidic family, which also shows you how widespread this group is. So we're talking about a girl who's at that point 12 years old and coming from a religious background, wrote as following: The thoughts we had and the ideas that we fed ourselves with were sickening. what we were going to do to the Germans because of what we lived through. We're going to cut them. You've got to live to take revenge. And that's what made us go and made us live. And we said that we're going to cut them into pieces. We're going to put salt on them. We're going to tie them to 2 horses and let the horses run. The most horrible, horrible things that could come to mind. We fed ourselves with hatred, and that made us live. Diaries, letters and notes written during the Holocaust show us the extent to which revenge was in the mind of men and women in camps, ghettos and hiding. Yet for most of the Holocaust victims, revenge had to remain imaginary. Increasing physical exhaustion, lack of access to weapons, fear of retributory actions against the whole community, lack of clarity regarding German plans, and finally, planned German policy of disinformation meant that physical revenge could not take place. Still, revenge, most often very abstract, usually against groups rather than individuals, helped them to cope and paradoxically gave them hope. One survivor explained, and I quote, "So we started thinking about uprising and about revenge, and I think that kept us going. Although it was senseless thought, but you know, that gave us the courage to survive, to do, because we planned. The plans weren't worth it, maybe in the beginning 5 cents, but we planned, and we saw ourselves outside, and we saw all the Nazis killed, and this kept us going." For a few young Jewish fighters, revenge materialized in 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Satisfying the widespread need for revenge was the Jewish underground's best way of establishing itself in the ghetto's collective consciousness. And next to the image of restoring quote-unquote Jewish honor, revenge was the key force considered to be the motivation for the uprising. Some of them saw those 2 concepts, the concept of restoring honor and the concept of revenge, as synonymous. To quote one of the insurgents, "We had only one slogan in common, revenge, to save Jewish honor, the honor of the Jewish nation, and with this, we went into battle." One of the fighters recalled that he purposefully stayed on the street to watch German crimes, so that he could, and I quote, "hate strongly enough." Revenge was also part of the post-war narrative of the uprising, with fighters described very commonly immediately after the war as driven by the need to avenge, and I quote again, "As one draws water from deep well, the feeling of revenge against the Germans, each day and each hour and each minute and each second awake and asleep, revenge." In November 1942, just after 300,000 Jews were taken to Treblinka, Jehiel Górny, who was a collaborator of the Warsaw Ghetto of the underground archive, the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote in his diary, "The hour of revenge. It will come after the war. People greet each other with the wish that it might all end quickly, so that the few surviving Jews might live long enough to see the end of the plague of Hitlerism and to take revenge." This need for revenge, which was so clearly expressed in diaries, in letters, in writings from camps and ghettos, which was depicted in songs and poems, which was screamed out in concentration camps during executions, which was scratched out on prison walls, did not die out on the need of liberation. If anything, it began to grow. When in 1963 Mark Dworzecki, who was a doctor from Vilna and survivor of the Vilna ghetto, named 3 factors which favored post-war adaptation of Holocaust survivors, he named them as following: the desire to live, the solidarity among the survivors, and the thirst for vengeance. 2 years later, 2 years earlier, Dworzecki himself participated in an event which united all 3 of them, and that was the Eichmann trial. But of course, vengeance took many forms and was not only aimed at the Nazis. Among the complexity of post-war search for justice and revenge, Polish Jews also sought what they considered to be justice for what seemed beyond the reach of the legal system. With minimal access to state apparatus, revenge was the only justice they could obtain. While in some spaces we know that the new authorities attempted to facilitate participation in state-conducted trials, this system of accountability was not long-lasting and was not structural. Individuals and community could only be made whole through actions which were not mediated by the mechanism of the state. And that was revenge. As a result, there's now a considerable amount of work on the occurrences and enormity of violence in post-war Europe. with extra-legal purges omnipresent basically everywhere in the immediate aftermath of the liberation. However, individual revenge acts which were carried out by Polish Jews were usually written out from this narrative. This is because Holocaust survivors were considered emotionally and physically incapable of revenge. They were destroyed by grief, they were disorientated in the new reality, they were leaving their former hometowns and then Poland, crushed and as a quote, crushed and broken in body, embarrassed and humiliated in spirit. The only strength and resources they could mobilize, it was thought, was in order to build a future rather than face the past. So the story of surviving the Holocaust usually had no place for revenge. As a result, Christopher Browning, in his 2010 study of Starachowice slave labor camp, wrote about the identity of perpetrators of revenge killing as part of the secret and communal story of the Holocaust, which was shared only among the small community of Holocaust survivors and which was equal to that of the stories of collaboration and stories of sexual violence. There's no question that the desire for revenge, so gratification and suffering of others, was considered vindicative and barbaric by nature. Revenge was considered inherently irrational. Violence was acceptable for reasons of defense, be it physical defense or defense of the honor of the nation, as was the case of the underground fighters, but not for the sake of moral satisfaction. Moreover, and that's also important, during the war, revenge also became part of the anti-Semitic narrative, also after the war, of a vengeful Jew. Thus, the stories of Polish Jewish revenge were silenced both by the individuals and by the community itself. Yet, of course, it does not mean that revenge did not take place. It did, and it was an important part of recovery both individually and as part of the community. It was taken not only to achieve emotional satisfaction, but also to restore self-worth after the extreme social degradation of the war. It was an attempt to restore the balance of suffering between the victim and transgressor. It was also a matter of honor and ethnic pride. So many wrote that not fulfilling a duty to avenge could be considered as harming the group and bringing shame both on oneself and on the community, and this was also taking place in the Jewish community. Those who took revenge were both those who were former prisoners of concentration camps and ghettos, who were witnesses to the suffering of the family members, who were witnesses to the death of the community, but also those who survived in the East, who were not directly, in that sense, physically affected by the crimes. The revenge thus was carried out in the name of those who were themselves victims, those who names in the name of those victimized, and also those who acted in the name of the entire community or solidarity. Revenge was carried out in specific places. These were what we refer to as affective spaces, so emotion-heightened spaces, places which were linked directly to the crimes committed during the Holocaust, and those with large concentration of Holocaust survivors. So they range from a busy street in Tel Aviv or Munich to places avoided by public memory. Various spatial settings evoke different kinds of emotions, but these were, and that's probably the most important also, spaces which offered various and very different kinds of practical way of dealing with the past. So in each of these spaces, Polish Jews, as I showed in my book, had different capacities for action, which were shaped both by external circumstances and by their own willingness and physical ability to act. So following Christopher Browning can differentiate between various post-Holocaust landscapes, limiting people differently and allowing for different choices. Some of them facilitated physical revenge and revenge for retribution, so allowing the use of responsive state apparatus, while others hindered it. Some were universal, so there were spaces with a large concentration of Holocaust survivors where emotions were collectively constructed and sustained, such as DP camps, for example. But there were also such spaces as unique personal geographies of revenge. So each survivor had their own unique personal geography of revenge, such as their hometown, which for them held special meaning. And most stories of revenge that I came across when doing my research are actually stories which take place in stories of local private revenge, which are taking place in such personal spaces. So This is revenge taken against local collaborators, often prewar acquaintances, in places with which survivors had emotional ties. Carrying out these acts of revenge was of course contingent on knowledge of local geography and often contacts with the local partisans. And at the same time, people who I wrote about were also involved in transnational projects such as communism and Zionism. And these allowed retribution either through responsive communist apparatus, and this especially in the part of Poland which later was located in the Soviet Union, or the network of Jewish honor courts, especially in DP camps. The Jewish honor courts were set up first in Poland and later in DP camps in Germany, Austria and Italy. So this is really interesting, and this is what we learn also from these stories, how individual places are imagined and reimagined as spaces, first of crime, and then later as spaces of revenge. As I already said, it's German perpetrators who are those people who most often appear in calls for revenge during the Holocaust. Yet in the post-war stories, they occupy relatively little space. Their crimes were often remote. They often did not come into direct contact with families of their victims, so those people who most often took revenge. They were more difficult to identify when encountered on the street or in communal space, if they would be encountered. And the only revenge that could be taken against them was that through retribution, so in a court setting, and this was not easy and this was not achievable for many. A group which was much more easier targeted for revenge were local collaborators. So while we know that many of those who survived the Holocaust in hiding did so with the help of non-Jews, it was also local collaborators who constituted the greatest threat of them. So facilitators and benefactors, as Mary Fulbrook calls them, or participating observers, as Elżbieta Janicka wrote, were people who were local non-Jews directly involved in the Holocaust, playing the key part, especially in the third stage of it, when after liquidation of ghettos, Jews were trying to survive in hiding both in cities and the countryside. And I think it can be said that suffering among non-Jewish locals was something that was shared by everyone who survived the Holocaust, and revenge against them was sought in many ways, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in the conversation after the talk, but it was mainly through physical attacks, through turning to the system of justice, and if possible, also through leaving evidence again about their crimes before leaving Poland. So in this case, we have quite a few testimonies among others in the Jewish Historical Institute, where someone explicitly writes that they leave this testimony in order to take revenge on the person, or in order to leave a testimony against those who acted against them. I think for me the most important group, and the third group against whom revenge was sought, were other Jews. So those considered to be collaborators. And we are collaborators at that point. Today, most likely people who are involved in forced cooperation. This is an extremely difficult term, and a term which was very difficult from the very beginning. This is a term that the meaning of which changes from the immediate post-war period, basically constantly. It also changes according to location where it's used. So these are people, I think, if we look at them more widely, who are under Jewish religious law, commit the crimes of informing, so hand other Jews over to foreign authorities. I think this is the widest definition. So mainly people who exercise dominance over other Jews in camps and ghettos, members and co-workers of the Jewish councils, so members of the Judenrat, though most likely these were directly involved either in deportations or in taking over Jewish property. Just being a member of the Judenrat was usually not enough to be considered a collaborator, or at least to be tried as a collaborator. Participants in deportations, death camps, especially the Jewish policemen, so the members of the Jewish Order Service. Again, mainly those who either directly participate in deportations or who participated in looting of Jewish property. And finally, functionary prisoners in concentration and forced labor camps, so kapos. This is the most difficult group, and one which was also most strongly differentiated, as it was also from the very beginning. People were aware that these were positions that were taken at the moment of threat to one's life. Most of these people remained or wanted to remain part of the Jewish community after the war, due both to their personal safety and also because in order to keep their immigration prospects. So they remained within the Jewish community both in Poland and then later in displaced persons camps. They were thus the easiest to track, and also survivors had the largest means at their disposal to punish them, from purely symbolic measures such as boycotts and denunciations, through use of various types of honor and religious codes, and finally through state codes, Polish state codes or allied military codes in displaced person camps. It also should be noted that with impossibility of revenge, and that's something that appears very often, some survivors found comfort in the vision of God avenging crimes committed against them. Since they could not take revenge against and on their own, it was the God of vengeance who was to act in their name as they expected him to do. In a poem based on the Book of Lamentation written in Hebrew in Warsaw Ghetto in September 1942, an anonymous writer wrote, and I quote now, "Only the creator of the universe, the maker of body and spirit, he can create the world anew. And the new world, the revenge will appear. And he will impart his revenge, and his hand will proclaim in the wicked kingdoms, in the evil government. He will issue the retribution, will incite the dispute. He will repay many times over, and will erase memory of its existence from under the heavens." In scriptures, vengeance, of course, is part of the legal system. It's related to justice, where the redress is the proportion of the injury inflicted. And survivors who sought to justify their actions in religion referred very often to vengeance on God, implying that revenge was sanctioned by God. So revenge, as carried out by them at a point, stops being a senseless aggression, but rather becomes part of them being faithful Jews. Vengeance and revenge were also used in a way to signify divine judgment. So when explaining their need for revenge, survivors often wrote they carried out on behalf of God, and thus the vengeance became holy, and the avenger becomes the agent of God. Of God's vengeance against those, and I quote, "impure murderers who lost their godly image." On the other hand, survivors often wrote of revenge as a religious duty when they referred also to the dead relatives. So they would write that the dead relatives on the death, when dying, would call them to carry out the religious duty or the holy duty of revenge. When we speak about the spatial aspect of revenge, which I already mentioned, it's interesting to note that this call to God for revenge, especially memorial books, very often takes place in a very specific space, and that's the space of a plundered or destroyed hometown. So a survivor returns, they are in a plundered synagogue or on a devastated cemetery, and this is the place from which they call the God on vengeance. Standing in the courtyard of his town's abandoned synagogue, one survivor reflected, and I quote, that's a mention from a memorial book. "Now it is silent, silent as a grave. Everything turned to ruin. Only the great synagogue remains, standing alone, as if immersed in deep mourning. It was weeping for its worshippers who are no more. It was as if echoes could be heard from inside. God is a God of vengeance. God of vengeance appear. Rise up the judge of the earth, pay back the arrogant. Where is the God of vengeance who will take revenge for our pure blood that was spilled?" So far, I mainly spoke about men, and it would seem that indeed the act of carrying out revenge was a masculine action, yet there are also women who took revenge. And I will tell you about two cases, both of which are actually corroborated by other sources, so that you can also see the narrative of revenge through women. One of them comes from a woman called Maria Szabotwinik, who wrote an article entitled "On the Path of Revenge" in a memorial book of her community, of Krzywicza, where she wrote, "I neglected everything, my husband, my daughter. I wanted revenge for my whole body and life." She writes, "I did not go anywhere, I did not ask anyone for help, but quietly, step by step, I began tracing all murderers who took people out of the hiding places and handed them over to the Germans or to the local collaborators. I had to fulfill the promise I gave to my own heart. Yearning for revenge, which was often stronger than me, fully took me over, so I began my mission." In her story, which again also finds corroboration in the same book from other authors, she writes about tracing local collaborators and then handing them over to the security apparatus. on the way she's helped by other women, which is also an interesting story. And also by 2 bottles of vodka, which she writes she keeps carrying around to make sure that the men are actually in prison. Another woman, in a story which is corroborated by a newspaper article, which I managed to locate, though this is a story I actually did not believe for quite a long time, until I found article newspapers which corroborated fully. Another woman tells the story about, another woman survived in occupied Poland. Her son was denounced by a Ukrainian man. Another child survived, but after the war she decides to leave the surviving child behind after she's reunited with the other child, and then goes on and looks for the man who denounced her son. And she wrote, "I had only one aim, to survive and to get my revenge on Wołoczka." And I'm mentioning him because he was later sentenced. After the liberation, I looked everywhere in Lower and Upper Silesia, because this is where they repatriated. Finally, after a year of searching, I found him in a village called Jawor near Legnica. The bandit got 15 years in prison, but it did not soothe my pain. I will never lessen after the death of my 2 sons. And there is actually an extensive newspaper coverage of this story at that point, which tells of this man who did indeed turn over a 9-year-old boy, that was her son, and 30 other people to the Gestapo, and received a sentence of 15 years. In the newspaper, it also said that he kept claiming innocence, and in court was confronted by a very emotional statement of the mother of the boy, who was mentioned. So as I said, these stories cross traditional gender lines. Those women are abandoning their families. They are turning from mothers to avengers, and they become invested with masculine attributes. But of course, these stories are already mentioned, and this is something which I found incredibly difficult when working on these stories and on these testimonies. Is the issue that immediately comes to mind is that of historical veracity. So the question is, how much of it is actually true? Because they do carry incredible emotional weight, and they do pose methodological and historiographical changes. They do leave us with questions. How were wartime fantasies of revenge lived out in real human encounters? To what extent is individual memory the reflection of the dominant discourse of the society? To what extent was the narrative of revenge used to create meaning in one's post-war life? And a person who questioned many of these stories was Itzhak Zuckerman, one of the leaders of the underground in the Warsaw Ghetto, who, writing about the emotional landscape of immediate post-war Poland, wrote in his memoirs following: "Ultimately, revenge was perverse romanticism, which totally unhinged a few people. It was simply a product of constantly living with tension, ready for vengeance and killing, and not carrying it out. In some, there was no revenge. There were words, there was talk that went for months and filled their whole existence." Now, of course, we can question whether Itzhak Zuckerman wrote that because that's what was happening, or whether he wrote that because he himself did not carry out revenge, as we know from his memoir, and that's something that stayed with him for the rest of his life, this opportunity and choosing not to take revenge. But there's no doubt that it is indeed extremely difficult to write and to check veracity of these stories. There's basically no official documentation regarding individual post-war revenge in rural areas, and where revenge usually take place. And those official documents also rarely give voice to non-elite protagonists, so people who carried out. Thus, this story, if it's to be told, has to be based on the victim's memory, which is transmitted in testimonies, diaries, letters, eyewitness statements, oral history collections, and memorial books. Each of them, of course, also coming from different period of time, which makes it more difficult. There's no doubt that in many of these, there are certain reappearing universal themes and patterns. In some of them, stories of revenge resemble literary fiction with very easily recognizable literary tropes. The stories of post-war revenge are often very clearly exaggerated in order to meet the discourse expected of those who write. And this is especially clear in memorial books, where I have no doubt that many of those stories are written for that reason. It often remains also difficult to establish to what extent the individual memories of survivors were already shaped at that point through interactions with other survivors, to what extent they reflect the discourse of community rather than their own experiences. So what I would claim, I think this is something that comes very, very clearly from this book and from this research, is that when we are looking at post-war stories and memories of post-war stories, we should treat them really the same way as we do today. Treat wartime stories, and we should not renounce the validity as such, of course, but nonetheless they should be interpreted and nurtured in the way which we usually associate with wartime memory. There's of course also the issue of translation, something that appears in wartime stories, but also in post-war memories. So that the issue of translation from Polish, Yiddish, and Hebrew, and then the way in which it was translated into English. Now, I'll just show you one example, which comes from 1946, because this is something that was already noted by David Boder. And David Boder, as I'm sure you know, was a pioneer of collecting oral histories among Holocaust survivors who worked in DP camps and carried out a series of interviews with displaced Holocaust survivors. And in one of the interviews, there was a female Polish Jewish survivor who provided him an account in English about her life during the Holocaust. And in the last sentence, she switched to Polish and called all the Jews, now I quote, to hate the Germans because of the wrongs that they did to us and our families, because they broke our hearts, broke our homes, and we ought never to forget that. So in this and other cases, there's also an issue of who we're talking to, and the message aimed at the Jewish audience conveyed in the language of the community, as opposed to messages aimed at broader audience, and then of course the issue of language, of English coming later on, and what we talk about in English and what we talk about in our native language. So as I said, we are basically in no position today to check the veracity of details described in testimonies from 1946 and 1947. Most of them left no trace in archival sources. And these emotional reactions and these emotional stories which we deal with when talking about revenge cannot be proved in historical terms. Yet I think and I believe that those stories are nonetheless extremely valuable when it comes to assessing collective fears, values, and moral standards, as well as the construction of narrative when considering revenge. So it seems that it would be much more effective to approach them and analyze them, looking at them above all as collective conception of fears, of aspirations, of dreams, of stereotypical reactions, of community standards. And I'll just make a note here. When working on this topic, and when I started quoting testimonies, when I started first presenting this topic before I wrote the book, the main criticism I had was that these stories are not true. And everybody was saying that constantly. It was constantly repeated. And now I know many of them are actually true. But nonetheless, they do pose a methodological challenge. And to conclude, following each of the many crises tearing through Eastern Europe, people who were wronged by their oppressors, neighbors, or private enemies were searching for justice. With the state apparatus absent or barely working, they often resorted to individual violence and private acts of revenge to settle accounts against the wrongdoers. Just the decades of wars and conflict in East Central and Eastern Europe can be seen as a continuum of crisis. The killings and lynchings that followed it can be called the continuum of vindicative violence. And I think understanding this continuum of violence tells us a lot about societal dynamics in this part of the world. It underscores the breakdown of traditional mechanisms of justice and profound impact of prolonged crises on the society. So the discussion of revenge, which I hope will carry out and which we'll have in the discussion following this, raises questions about justice, about morality, about the role of violence in society. And as we reflect on this period, and as we reflect on today, I think it's important to consider the complexities of human behavior, the limitations of the legal system, the long-lasting impact of violence, and the way in which revenge belongs to the social dynamics of the times of crisis. I try to do.
Thank you so much, Katarzyna. And maybe we could open our discussion. Do we have questions already? If not, I will overuse then my role as moderator. Yeah, sorry.
No, please.
And yeah, I wanted to ask you about like the memory of revenge, like performing revenge or being the subject of revenge. Like, do you know, like, was it passing also to the next generation, or it was mostly like silenced?
That is incredibly interesting because we have very different sources for these stories, and they differ in that sense, depending on what we see as passing. If we think about memorial books, so each copy had the books which were created by inhabitants of each community, surviving inhabitants of the community after the war, and printed. Revenge plays an extremely important part of these books. So if we think that this is the communal memory that we want to pass on to the next generations, and I think we can treat memorial books as this. This is the communal memory of a community. Revenge appears in basically all of them, they are. I mean, there's a lot of research now on the way in which they are they should be used as analyzed as literary sources, but revenge is everywhere there, and that's revenge taken during the war, revenge taken after the war, and then very often carried out into the post-war life in Israel. There's also very often appears traces of stories of people who joined the army, for example, and this is also treated as revenge, as post-war revenge. So in that sense, absolutely. Then of course there's a question, but on the other side of the spectrum, we have oral histories and testimonies of revenge, as they appear in those interviews which were conducted in 1990s or 2000s, and we have very little revenge on the other side. On the other hand, those testimonies which are in English tell a very different story of the Holocaust, the redemptive story of the Holocaust, which does not have space for revenge. And there people actually very often say that they chose not to do revenge, that the revenge is being a witness, the revenge is going to schools, the revenge is living or having family. They did not take revenge physically after the war. And then very often appears there. So we have those two very, very conflicting ways of talking about revenge.
Thank you so much, and we have also questions from the audience.
Yeah, hey, is it on? Yeah. Thank you very much for this lecture. I find the topic fascinating. I haven't read the book, but I would absolutely read it in the next weeks, probably. I have a lot of questions, many different directions, but I would perhaps focus on something that is you partially answered now. Whether you came across, because when we work with ego documents, sometimes we have, let's say, the pleasure of working with documents that were created by the same person in two different times, in the early mid-30s, and then later people that gave interviews. If you came across in such cases, and whether you found stories in which a person talked about revenge and perhaps contemplated revenge, and then later expressed regret of having this will to revenge. And secondly, I was wondering if you also came across cases of group revenge. I'm thinking perhaps of partisans that conspired together and had plans, actual survivors that would also have the abilities and the skills to really revenge because they know how to use weapons. They might even have weapons, and some sort of a group that decided on that together. And perhaps one last question that perhaps was also partially answered. Revenge that is perhaps not directed directly to a person that they knew, but of a nationality maybe, or broader group. Perhaps revenge against Poles or descendants of collaborators or perpetrators. Yeah.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question. When it comes to people participating in event, the stories which I did come across were stories of people who joined the security apparatus after the war and then left Poland. And in many of those files, the personal files of young Jews who joined militia in, for example, in Poland, in Lublin in 1944, we very often come across either in their own files or whatever, their own letters of when they joined the apparatus, or the opinions of their supervisors. They joined it driven by the wish for revenge, especially among insurgents and Polish underground in the forest. So saying that, I mean it's in the forest because they use the term forest, people from the forest, and they say they actually joined it because they wanted to take revenge for crimes committed against the families. And I did not come across anyone who said, you know, later on in life that he joined this security apparatus because he wanted to take revenge. But we know many of them did. So that's one such case. When it comes to stories which are described and where people say they actually felt, I mean, they were happy. They were happy that they talked about and they expressed regret. These are stories of revenge taken immediately after liberation concentration camps. There was, as we know, a widespread wave of violence against prisoner functionaries, mainly against prisoner functionaries at that point in the camps. And I came across quite a few testimonies of people when they wrote about participating and not feeling fine about it. But this is also the revenge that was more, I would say, widely acceptable in the narrative, in the sense that people did not feel bad talking about it. This was something that was natural, it was happening, and we have a lot of testimonies of such revenge coming from post-war, coming from 1999 and oral histories, and you know, another thing about, actually, I think there's people were more likely to talk about it later on in life than earlier on because it was so natural that people took revenge at that point. They did talk about it later on, often in detail. Though there were also people who talked about why they did not take revenge in the concentration camps after the war. But nonetheless, it's something they regretted. When it comes to group revenge, I did not research it as such, because I looked at individuals. I had to limit myself. But of course, if there's any revenge during the Second World War, it's group revenge, and that's what's taking place among the partisans. And in memorial books, memorial books in English. In memorial books, you have extensive descriptions of people who join the partisan units and take revenge that way, often acting against the leadership, like acting out of their own wish to take revenge on local non-Jews who, one way or another, harm their families or harm themselves. So this is very common, very, very common.
And what about targeting a broader group of, in regard of revenging not particular people, but perhaps a nationality or descendants or
no, I know what you mean,
generations?
yes. There's a lot of, basically everything, a lot of what we read during the war what was written during the war, what I quoted, were wishes to act the whole nation, right? Mainly Germans. But then we were scared. People sometimes write about it, but not necessarily, it's not something that's materializing.
Thank you.
Kasiu, thank you for this amazing lecture. Thank you so much. I was thinking through your lecture about revenge as a historical duty. And if we can say about Jewish historians, because like I was thinking about this famous quote that actually we put in Onek Shabbat monument of Nahum Grzybacz in August and 42, we want to stay alive not for our own sake but also to alarm the world. And have you ever thought about like a historical like Jewish duty as a form of revenge? So this is my question, and the other is representation of revenge in the first historical exhibitions. Now it's like a really great exhibition in the Deutsches Historisches Museum created by Agata Pietrasik, and then was really strong underlining the elements of the revenge in a Paris exhibition, but also in the Jewish Museum in Warsaw. How you can refer this in a visual, let's say, Jewish culture in a visual exhibition. But the first one is more important than the historical duty as a revenge.
Absolutely, in a sense that in here revenge is part of the of Jewish heroism. It's avenging the blood of Israel. All of this, or rebuilding Masada. This is like constantly coming through in that narrative. But this is not, narrative is one thing, and what people actually do is another. So, in the narrative, yes, it appears. In the way people write about it, yes. But of course, they carry out revenge on a former neighbor, not on. If they do, of course, if they do, that's another issue, because we have again, and I think this is something that should be stressed over and over again. We have those stories. Whether they actually take place is another issue. Now, post-war, in the immediate post-war period, the imaginary of revenge and the concept of revenge is again very tricky because of also because of political situation in Poland. This constant narrative of Jews coming back to take vengeance, which is part of basically every pogrom talk in Poland in 45-46, that the Jews are coming back and the Jews will take over your everything. They are coming back to take revenge. And there was a very strong need among the Jewish community, leadership of the Jewish community, to silence those stories of revenge also because of that.
Thank you very much. I would like to draw a parallel to Daria Matindy's research on famine in Ukraine in 1932-33, and she also did like oral histories and also other sources, and she's also writing about this type of kind of imagined revenge, more like a retribution or God's retribution, that actually, because in many cases, or even in most cases, the perpetrators of the famine, of this artificial famine in Ukraine, they went unpunished, and that's why actually people, survivors from the families, they were more like fantasizing about kind of retribution coming from God to perpetrators, like heavy illnesses of their children, different types of like natural catastrophes happening to them, and of course it reflects a situation when for many decades people had to live together in those villages, like very close as neighbors for many decades, and they had maybe no opportunity, of course, because of political circumstances. They had even no opportunity to do any revenge in real sense. So I think it's also very interesting that it depended maybe a lot on how people were living together or not living together in this post-war decades. And in general, I think it's quite interesting that there are these parallels between different historical events and situations of crimes, and this idea of revenge more is imagined than real.
Absolutely, and I think that also, as I said, something comes back after crisis, after crisis, after crisis. But we talk about imaginary revenge, but I think we should also know that revenge can be taken as against the so-called collaborators is very real. It's extremely. I mean, it's there. If we know stories of people who are who were basically chased their entire lives, people who are members of Jewish councils or members of the Jewish police who were tried again in various honor codes, religious codes, who were attacked, attacks which took place for many years after the war. So it was, was imagined, but it was also very real, especially especially almost only among those against whom revenge could physically be taken, so people who were considered to be collaborators. And these are tragic stories that we know, and they're very much there. So I think that also shows that if revenge could be taken, it would happen.
So I also would like to draw a parallel but to our current situation, to contemporary Ukraine, because we hear the word revenge. We also use it in our fantasies about what's going to happen after the war. Usually we have this conversation after some bigger things happen, for example, like bombing and death of many innocent people, like we have often in Kyiv or in more eastern parts of Ukraine. I remember there was one fundraising of some big foundation that was called for revenge.
Mm-hmm.
So we could delegate our revenge to people in the army, and we could hope that they are gonna do something proportional to what is happening in this bombings, in the shellings, in the and in that for the civilians. So I just wanted to comment it, and I think for us it's a way to overcome the frustration, also our personal frustration, but very often we cannot do anything, but we feel very emotional about what's happening to other Ukrainians, not only if it's happening in our city, but also if it's happening to children, to pregnant women, to all the things we see, and we see this encouragement. We should donate more money to the army because it's gonna help to have a justice, because it's the only justice we can hope for. It's the justice that is coming from our army. So it was very interesting to listen to your talk, because it's not only history for us; it's also our daily reality, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I probably want, in a different way, to follow on Wada's comment and actually ask about the role and the presence of state. Because also, while we are in the midst of unfinished war, is state and the army, and it's something you delegate. Because I think the process of justice is a process of also delegating it to responsible, to courts, to God, right? But it's also always proportionate and also partial.
Yeah.
It's never, you cannot hang a person who is responsible for killing 10,000 people 10,000 times, right? You just cannot. So like in a way, but kind of like having this relation with the present or absent or distant or unclear state, right?
Uh-huh.
The state is one of the judiciary pillars. They talked about the community courts, honor courts. It's one sphere, but there is the sphere of legal international national courts, right? Where legal system. My actual rather question would be how the establishment of the state of Israel growing, and then in the 50s, 60s, the kind of carrying out justice as a state influenced, or you see any influence of that, which was mediated in media, had any impact on the revenge thoughts and revenge actions, or just simply because we also have to think about time, because people were aging, people were also, I don't know, that's kind of the temporality, or that's something that is more present in the 40s, and then it just goes away because individual, do other things, or can't, or it's, so there's just a rather personal trajectory of human life and body, right? And over this big history as a beginning of the state, Jewish state which can carry out, in this case, that's a justice, kind of decreases or gives this like a type of, if not a satisfaction, but a sense of justice being delivered, even if partially. I don't know if that makes sense, the question.
No, it's fantastic. It's extremely complex. It's a fantastic question. So yes, the couple trials which are carried out in Israel in the 1950s are considered to be the last trials of collaborators, quote unquote, during the Holocaust. But whether that changed anything, that's a good question. Whether a court changed anything. This is especially when we talk about well, mainly again here, trials of collaborators, because these are the ones which are most often targeted. When it comes to Jewish community, we have the honor courts, which are being set up in order to stop revenge. That's the main reason they're being set up, because there's a wave of physical acts of attacks in DP camps, which are carried over and over again. Also, the same thing is happening in Poland. The honor court is being set up in order to channel this need for revenge into a communal court. Whether that works, I don't think it does really. In a sense that some being cleared away court does not mean that in the eyes of those surrounding you, you are suddenly becoming innocent. And we have cases of people who are actually addressing even those courts. They're not saying that they actually address it themselves, asking for rehabilitation. This is very common in DP camps. This is also common in Poland in a sense that they are, because they are being hunted or because they feel there's because they want to emigrate, they want to start life anew. They actually ask the court to clear their name in front of the community so that they can live as innocent people. And again, doesn't really work in most cases because this happens. We have people who are tried by Jewish honor courts and they go to Polish state courts and they try it again and again and again. That's so. This is. I don't think that works really. I think if someone is seen as a quote-unquote collaborator, that just haunts them for the rest of their lives. I think. Not my. Yeah. This is how I see it. The last cases I know of people being attacked as collaborators, I think, are from 1990s. In Australia, of all places. In a shop in Australia. So that keeps happening.
Australia, I have a thought about Australia. I left it aside for the moment because I found it also interesting because Australia was a place where many immigrated from Eastern Europe. It was a very large destination for immigration, and I find it actually very interesting to see how communities from same places immigrate to a continent where it's supposedly neutral, a land where these crimes did not take place in. Australia, whether it participated in the Second World War or not, at least it's not dominated in that narrative. And you have communities that kind of are uprooted from Eastern Europe, and there are in Australia where you have victims, perpetrators, bystanders, all of a sudden living in Australia in proximity to one another. And there are many cases in which victims identify perpetrators or collaborators, and they say they live across the street, or they work in the shop next to where I work. And I was wondering, and you have a government that doesn't have any complicity, or supposedly a government that was not involved, it's supposed to be perhaps unbiased, but you also have the background of the Cold War. It's not like a concrete question. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on revenge in that environment? Because I found it really interesting what happened in Australia,
but also in South America.
Yeah,
And we have a lot of cases in South America of people who are. I mean, a lot. I can't keep saying a lot, but a lot. I mean, a few that we know of people who are attacked on the streets in South America, of trials that are being carried out there, and then go back. Then are being referred back to Poland, and that's also quite interesting in how those communities, in as long as the honor code also is functioning, so until early 50s, are actually sending those stories back to Poland, because so they can be tried by those who know. That's another issue when it comes to honor codes, is who's judging who, and who knows how to speak, who understands these crimes. And in order to do that, they correspond to the Jewish honor code in Warsaw. The Jewish honor code is actually trying those cases, which are, sort of trying of giving testimony against those cases. And also, and this is something I also came across quite a few times, is that those in those communities they are asking for the perpetrator here, so collaborator in this case, to be sent back to Poland, to go back to where the crime was committed.
and the role of the government, because I was wondering, in Australia you have stories of survivors that say that they contacted the local authorities, and they informed them that these people are living in Australia, they live in Sydney or anywhere else, and they say that the government did not react. In some of the cases, they even informed the people that were accused so they could live someplace else, because in the context of the Cold War, perhaps Australia, the government thought, well, these are people that knows how to fight communism. We want them perhaps to stay here. Perhaps they could be of use for us. I just wonder if you came across that, and what are your thoughts on
Of Polish state being involved in those cases? Yes, absolutely. I'm not absolutely. I'm saying again, we're talking about a few cases in each time. When I say that, it sounds like hundreds, but it's. I don't have such a large, but yes, there are cases absolutely of Polish government being, Polish state services being addressed by Jewish communities in France about a quote-unquote collaborator who was living there, and these cases were being also investigated in Poland, and they were corresponding with the Jewish honor code in Warsaw, so there was many actors in those cases.
And could you perhaps know or indicate, were there attempts of revenge in these cases, or perhaps plans or ideas or thought of revenge in these cases?
In the sense that people were usually attacked to begin with, yes, that's how it all began in most cases. So they were not killed, but physically attacked.
Thank you. I wonder whether in this early period, 44 to early 50s, during the period when honor codes were actually active, were there, and because you mentioned yesterday that there was intense debate around these honor codes, and these were reported in publications of the DP camps. Were there shades of grey that people were reflecting on? I mean, we use now in our discussion the term perpetrator and victim, as if these categories are always that clear-cut. Were there people who were saying, well, sometimes it's a bit more complicated? Were there people who were saying, this person did something wrong, but we have to understand? I mean, were there moderating voices?
Oh,
and who were there?
Favorite topics, I can talk about it forever. Yes. First of all, the cases that were in front of honor codes, especially in DP camps, were incredibly difficult, because there were words of two people against each other. You had one person saying something and another person saying something, and that was it, and maybe another one showed up. So, they were tricky to begin with. there was immense, I mean, very significant discussion around functioning of honor codes in terms of how, there were a few key factors. One of them was the future of the community. So what's best for the future of the community, whether it's clearing those people out or whether they should be brought back into the community in order to rebuild, to build a community. Another one was the image of how honor codes trials affect the image of Jews outside, especially in Poland in say 46, 47, 45, 46, in DP camps as well. So to what extent these are actually should be our internal matters, to what extent they should be, they should be openly discussed because of the image of the community was best. To what extent this should be punishment, to what extent it should be... The concept of justice in honor codes was something that was constantly discussed. In a way that it was a very strong... Because they were created in order to stop revenge and to stop those attacks. There was a very... And I think they were definitely more lenient in their rulings they should have been because of that. Because they wanted to stop this omnipresent need for revenge, and and serve justice just as such. There was also an issue of who was sitting on the court, so who was judging who, whether these are people coming from who were surviving the East, whether they're actually more morally fit to judge those who committed quote-unquote crimes during the Holocaust, or whether they should actually be direct survivors of the Holocaust in occupied Poland because they are the only ones who understand. All those discussions were constantly happening. And here when I say constantly, I actually mean how constantly, I don't mean 3 cases. I mean this is something that appears in DP camps, in DP press a lot. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about how much this image and this desire for which we're talking about, how much is it inherited by the next generations, by the children of the survivors or the grandchildren, and how much is it present, I don't know, in their writing or in their in the construction of their identity, and also if there were cases when children or grandchildren were taking direct action in any activity which was connected to revenge, like legal courts or anything.
Oh wow, it's such a good question. And I think this also brings us to my most disliked topic of what's revenge and what's justice. In a sense that we're talking about revenge, but these people of course consider to be justice. And the issue of justice unfulfilled and how the next generation sees the justice that wasn't done and the children of those who acted against their parents and no punishment came to them. I think that's a completely different and huge topic and very present, as we all know.
It's also like what resonates with this incomplete or not performed justice and delegating it to God or delegating it to, it's kind of often or sometimes it has like generational. So like kind of that's on one hand, if you think about generation transmission and this actually acting, so it's one thing, but generational aspect is in like cursing, like that you will not have for generations this, or your children. Yeah. It's also like not against the person who did that, but against the children of that person, so like transferring that across generation on the point of the, so I think that we're also here looking at not Ira but also Oksana and the also in an ethnography and collecting that. But also I was recalling, unfortunately, our colleague Petro Delhano had to go, and I think it was at his presentation about one of the Berlin, so in one of the ghettos in Berlin, and then how a family story of a neighbor who knew that a neighbor took Jewish property or things, and that neighbor who took, which is not a moral act, right? So it's about morality, and his or her, I forgot the gender, went to study in a bigger city, which I think was Lviv, and the neighbor said that, asked if the child could live here because the neighbor's child was living. Said, no, you don't take this child of that person because of this moral wrongdoing. We do not know whether it's revenge or not, right? But this is a kind of how this moral repercussion of, and we're talking about non-Jewish, so the wrong thing was done against Jews, but that the scenarios after the war was living on in this small neighborhood, community where people knew who did what, and that knowing who did what could or could not. So that's also influenced what was done or not done. It's like here not helping to have a room made for the time of the. It's very, very light thing in the spectrum of what was revenge or not revenge, but how it also was widespread in a way of how you shape your what you do and you don't do depending on what happened during the war. And I think that's also it's a bigger part of the. I'm also looking at Iran and probably taking too much time. Also how state plays in this, and that how, for example, Soviet state had this so clear policy, probably also as a Polish, it so matter what you did during the war, asking everybody to write down where you were, what you were doing in your application for job, your application for the file, that you have to explain where you and where your relatives were during the war, which kind of on this hand, on the other hand, it's the context of Cold War, and another, it's a context also of states violently establishing its authority, and in the process conducting illiberal justice, but running after people who were collaborating, or that, in what way, were really collaborating. So the last trials in Soviet Ukraine were like late 80s. And if you think about number of people who were tried in Eastern Europe, it's also a thing that, and people who were in Nazi Germany, it's like huge number of, the gap is huge. It's lots of people who went for trial here than those who went for trial in West Germany or into Germany, right? So that's probably about scope and temporality.
Yeah, and then it's an issue of children, but also of course of women, and that's another one. This being a woman affiliated with someone considered to be a collaborator, a wife or a surviving partner, or that's something that's again another part which is conflict. Yeah.
Following up, and please stop me. I missed the part of discussion if someone already asked it, but there is this phenomenon of prevention of revenge. And I think about Stalin's campaign against Jewish doctors in the 50s, and the story behind was exactly that they so that there is a kind of conspiracy behind that. Do you see that patterns like that in your sources?
Well, the stereotype of Jews taking revenge that you mentioned is something that's clear and also clear. I mean, not immediately to this day, basically. Sorry. I say that, yes, that's something that's present to this day. Of Jews coming back, Jewish ghosts coming back, and there's lots of layers to that. Of coming back and taking revenge on Poles, yeah. So it's something that's, I think, present to this day. And in that sense, it was also part of the post-war narrative, very strongly.
I have also a question about, like listening to have a discussion and having in mind your book. I think that choice of revenge is very hard choice, and in your book you provide few examples when people were unable to perform, like physically unable to perform revenge. I mean personal revenge, like to kill person or even looking on collective on people being killed. I mean by hanging. So I wanted to ask you about the about like process decision. So did you encounter some sources when people are telling how much other people or state itself influenced their decision to do a revenge?
Or not do it. And I think we know these stories because people felt extreme need afterwards to explain why they did not take revenge. And Zuckerman is one of these people. Both did not. There's a story, always stories memoir, when he could have attacked the Jewish police, when he chose not to. And he writes a lot about it because he feels the need to explain why he did not do that. So I think it was more expected that people would, in this narrative, rather than not do. So the stories that we know of, they are mainly coming from the immediate aftermath in concentration camp, where people write that they chose not to do something, but then they need to explain why they did not do that. So I think that, especially in case of men, the expectation or whatever they expect on themselves was that to do it rather than not to do it. And when it comes to state, that people were satisfied with the state. Not in Poland, definitely, but maybe as well now. I don't think that's what they wanted. I mean, maybe when it comes to German perpetrators being hanged, it's a different story. But when it comes to local collaborators and also Jewish collaborators, definitely not.
If I may have one more question, I was also thinking about other contexts, I mean temporally and politically, about genocide and in Rwanda and later mass killings in Rwanda, but also South Africa and Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. So these are like two different or three different stories. But do you think we could somehow methodologically approach them with same instruments, or put them in line of thinking about this?
I think they're the same mechanisms, in different contexts, but nonetheless it's the same continuum happening. Sorry, I should have something better to say other than, but yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Katarzyna, and thank you all. And yeah, we are finishing our.
That was the worst last
today.
answer in the history of this place. But yeah.
But give us a lot of space.
But, yeah.